This is so I'm going to talk to you about my book that came out this past summer, and I'm really glad to get the chance to do this, to talk with you all, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. And I'll just jump right in. So normally when I give this talk, I start with this slide, and I guess I'm starting with this slide now as well, because I feel like I often have to convince people that, or at least remind people why they should care about campaigns. And of course, one reason, the reason people often are interested in campaigns and is the resulting election, right? Who holds the power of elected office, especially at the highest levels, but all up and down the ballot, or all up and down the levels of government. And that's, of course, enormously consequential for everything from, whether and how many checks we're getting during COVID for relief from the various financial challenges many people suffered, to, policies around the border and immigration, to policies around inclusion and respect for transgender people. That one affects me directly as a transgender man. There's lots and lots and lots of reasons we should be interested in who holds political power. Assuming I don't need to convince you all of that, but it's sort of worth saying at the beginning anyway. I usually don't start right away with Bourdieu because, for many of the audiences I'm talking to, they don't know who he is, and for others, just because Bourdieu said something doesn't mean that it's necessarily interesting or worth studying. And I guess, fair enough. But for this group, I thought I'd start here because this is really a lot of Bourdieu's work is why I got into looking into campaigns and the people who run them. But this quotation from Political Representation, Elements for a Theory of the Political Field was really what sort of set me down this path. So he says, the political field is the site in which, through the competition between the agents involved in it, political products, issues, programs, analyses, commentaries, concepts, and events are created. Products between which ordinary citizens, reduced to the status of consumers, have to choose, thereby running a risk of misunderstanding that is all the greater the further they are from the place of production. So that sort of quotation really informs a big chunk of my research agenda. Both, I look both at the production side of politics, which is what this book is about, and also the reception side and the insight that part of what is going on for people who are not that politically engaged is this distance from the place of production. So I'm happy to talk about both of those if you like. But that quote really got me interested in this question of where do our politics, and this is a book about American politics, where do they come from? Who are the actors, who are the agents involved in that competition, and how do the products that they put out get produced? How do they get made? So the other thing that I think is important is what are, or the other reason that's worth understanding is because those products, the communications, the email messages, the ads, the speeches, the door knocks, there's all of the things that campaigns in the US do are a big part of not just how people decide whom to vote for, but for a lot of people, a big part of the political information they get, full stop. If you're not a person who goes seeking out political news and follows, politics on every day on Twitter and so on, you might, you could most of the time not even, might not know who your senator is. You might not be really, might not be getting much political information. But when an election comes around, the campaigns spend billions and billions of dollars in the last few cycles on trying to reach voters. And so how they do that and who they try to reach, I think has a big effect on how a lot of people understand what politics is, who it's for, what it's about, what the stakes are. And a lot of that communication is of the sort that many people have criticisms of. A lot of it is about fear, a lot of it is about division, a lot of it is about sort of tearing the other candidate down. Not all of it, certainly, but a lot of it. So I think, all of those are reasons to be interested in where this comes from, as well as to be interested in sort of what campaigns do more broadly. The other piece of what campaigns do, I mentioned contact, is they decide, whose doors they're going to knock on, who they're going to call to try to get them to come out. And there's real stratification, real inequality in who hears from campaigns. So this chart just shows the percentage of people. So overall, about half of people reported hearing from a campaign in the 2020 election. But that campaign contact was not evenly spread throughout the income distribution. So you can see here that people who were in households earning over $100,000 a year were almost twice as likely to say they heard from a campaign or a party at some point during the 2020 election than the poorest people in the US, those in households earning under $30,000 a year. And of course, that means if you understand anything about the US, or really many other countries as well, but certainly the US, if there's income inequality or class inequality, there's also going to be racial inequality. So you can see here that white people were also the most likely by a fair amount to say that they'd heard from a campaign in the last election. So where does all this come from? This is a sort of a selection of the people who work on campaigns. Some of them are people who end up on television fairly frequently, who you might recognize. Some of them are more behind the scenes players, or at least not at the level of fame where they were the White House secretary and press secretary, and you know who they are. And some of them are people that I interviewed in both of those categories. And you can see already that they don't look like the US as a whole. They're much more likely to be men. They're much more likely to be white. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But generally, the research question that motivated this book is who is producing our politics? How do they do it? How do they understand the work they do? All sort of for the purpose of understanding how that interaction between the people who essentially, how they mediate our politics, right? These are the people whose job it is, or whose job it could or should be, to make a connection, to communicate between regular people and politicians. They're the people surrounding politicians, both when they run for office and often actually when they get elected as well. How do they see their jobs? How do they see voters? How do they approach their work? And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about from here. So first, just to give you a sense of what I did to answer that question. Over the course of actually over a decade, although I wasn't working on it the entire time, I had a whole other book in the middle there. I did interviews with 84 interviews with 72 campaign professionals. They all had some experience in a campaign at the national level, so a presidential campaign, or in some cases a contested Senate campaign. I found them a variety of ways, basically any way I could. I had worked on the Obama campaign in the summer and fall of 2008, so I knew some people that way. I had some family friends, actually friends of family members of my partner who worked in politics or knew people who worked in politics. I also just did a bunch of cold emails. One of the ways I found people is there are 2 campaigns and elections magazines in the US, magazines for people who work in politics for their job. And they each nominate some number of people for awards every year. And I contacted people who had been designated as, one of them was called Rising Stars. I think the other was a 40 under 40 list or something like that. And I contacted people who appeared on those lists and said, I saw you were nominated for this, congratulations. I'd be interested in talking with you. And that got me a number of interviews. And then from there, actually, how I got to most of the more prominent people I spoke with was snowball sampling. So I'd ask for, do you know anybody who has run a campaign? Do you know anybody who's sort of higher up than you? Or I've been trying to reach so-and-so. Do you have any connections? And that got me a lot of people. Overall, it was a pretty balanced set of people, at least in terms of the relative to the campaign industry. So 31 Republicans, 40 Democrats, 1 person who works as an independent and only works with independent candidates, 53 men and 19 women, 65 white people, only 7 people of color, which is about where it was, at least in the earlier part of the research. I'll show you that in a second. And across, starting in 2009, and the last interviews I did were in 2020. I also put together a campaign careers database, which if any of you are currently PhD students, I would advise you not to do a dissertation with 3 different data sources that were as comprehensive as this, because it took me a very long time. But I have this data set now where there are every named staffer or consultant who worked on a presidential primary or general election campaign in from 2004 to 2020. That's about 500 or 5,000 people or so. I also have a lot of where that came from is this sort of weird website that this just a guy who lives in DC with a very sort of, he's not an academic. He maybe has a degree in political science. It was a little bit associated with George Washington University. But he just puts together this website where he lists basically everything possible about every presidential election. And so that is a source for, he includes, every staff member he can find. And that is where a lot of the sort of initial lists of staff members came from. And then we cross-reference that with LinkedIn, with Ballotopedia, with other online sources where people, show their pictures, where they list their jobs that they've had, where they list the schools they went to, and so on. And I put that together with the help of a lot of undergraduate research assistants. I'm happy to talk more about that if you like, but I want to get into sort of what are the findings that we had. So one is, the first thing, or one of the first things that people told me when I talked to them, I asked them sort of who does this kind of work? Talk to me about your job. And really a lot of them basically said that this is a job for weird people, or it's a strange exclusive club is how I characterize it. So Susan said people that work in politics are not normal people. Rufus said a lot of people in this field are odd, very odd people. And Arthur said a lot of the people in politics are the ones who ran for student council president in high school or class secretary. I don't know how well that sort of idea translates outside of the US, but it's a very, a lot of people in the US can sort of identify that very particular kind of person. So they meant it's people who are really passionate about politics in an unusual way, and that's true, but that's not the only way that it's a strange or exclusive club. So to sort of illustrate both what it takes to get into politics and the ways in which it is exclusive, let me take you through the career of somebody I call Chris. All of the people in the book and all the people I'll talk about are pseudonyms. I think that actually turned out to be really important. A lot of people said things to me that they explicitly followed up with, please don't quote me on that. Please don't let that be associated with my name. So I think that was really important, and not how a lot of books about this crew of people end up getting written. So Chris worked for his first campaign at age 11. He had a paper route in his neighborhood in a well-off suburb, and on his paper route he noticed that there were signs with this guy's name on them all over the place. And the guy was a friend of his dad's. He was running for a county level office, and Chris volunteered for his campaign. One of the ways he volunteered is he handed out campaign literature stuffed in with the newspapers that he was handing out. And that when that campaign was over, he was basically hooked. He thought it was so cool that this guy's name was everywhere. The candidate won, and he took Chris and the other kids he'd gotten to help him out to a party at a skating rink at the end of the campaign. And so Chris basically worked on every campaign that he could from then on, throughout high school, throughout college or university. When he graduated with his bachelor's degree, he got a job as a spokesperson for a family friend who was running for office. That person won, and he worked for him in his office when he won. And then after that, he decided he wanted to, this was sort of still a local office, he wanted to move into national politics. And so he started working his network He told me there were 5 different people that would take credit for getting him that job because he worked his network so thoroughly and effectively that 5 different people reached out to the congressperson who had an open job in his office, and Chris got that job. Later on in his career, he worked for Mitt Romney, both of the times he ran for president. And then after Romney lost in 2012, he decided he was done with campaigns. But he was still, both while he was working in campaigns and afterwards, often a commentator for cable news, doing the Sunday news shows, that sort of thing. He went into public affairs and lobbying work for a while. And now, last time I checked, he worked at a high-powered philanthropy or foundation. But this is one of those, it's officially a nonprofit, but what it primarily does is advocate for the political beliefs and interests of the family that runs the foundation. So it's not really outside of politics, it's just organized somewhat differently. So when you look through this list of the stages of Chris's career, there's a number of things you might notice. I mean, one is he's wielded an enormous amount of power and influence over his career. He's worked in a number of high-powered places. The other is that a lot of his work came through connections. So that kind of social capital that Chris has that he was able to translate into jobs is not something that's equally available across the class, income, education, race, etc. spectrums in the US. And so what that looks like is that campaign staff are not matched at all to by race or by education. I'll show you that in a second, to the rest of the US. So here on the left, I assume the left is the same for you as it is for me here. Anyway, on the left, I'm showing just the racial composition of adults in the US. There are about 60% white people, non-Hispanic white people, about 10 to 12% Black, about 15 to 20% Hispanic or Latinx, et cetera, et cetera. Voters are disproportionately white already, so at about 70%. Campaign staff overall, based on my data set, are about 80% white people. So really disproportionately white. Of course, if you're someone who follows US politics at all, you probably know that there are real differences between the two parties in terms of their racial composition. And so I thought it was important to look at the parties separately. So here I'm just showing the racial composition of US adults to start with, 2020 voters, and then you can see Democratic voters look roughly like at least in terms of the percent white, look roughly like the US as a whole. Somewhat higher, basically almost all Black people in the US when they vote for Democrats, or the vast majority of them, but otherwise looks about the same as the US as a whole. Democratic staff, however, where their voters are about 60% white people, their staff overall are about 68, 69% white people. Republican voters are much, much, much more white than the US as a whole. Republican staff, even though there's not much room to go up, are even a little bit more likely to be white. Now that's looking at the entirety of campaign staff, from the field operatives who are at the very bottom of the hierarchy, the office workers, et cetera, all the way to the campaign leaders. But the tops of the campaign organization and some departments, and I'll show you that shortly, are not nearly as diverse as even the staff as a whole among the Democrats. So this is Simone Sanders. She was high up in Joe Biden's campaign in 2020. And she's talking about this is not I didn't interview her directly, so I can identify her. This is from a podcast she was on, an interview she gave. And she's talking about, when I show up with a low cut, a bold lip, and a chilling analysis, people don't know how to take it because I'm not supposed to be able to give you a solid political commentary with a bedazzled name. In other words, being a Black woman with her particular presentation, but just being a Black woman at all really makes you really stand out in a lot of these spaces. And she talks in that interview about being one of the very few people who look like her in the places that she is. And you can often, there's Donna Brazile, there's a few other people, but there's not very many. And it's shifting a bit over time, but it's still pretty exclusive. So this is just Democratic campaigns in 2020. And what I want to point out is that disproportionately where you see people of color in Democratic campaigns is in the department that is called the political department. Now, when I first saw that, I was like, what? Why is there a political department in a political campaign? That's like having I don't know. Can't think of a good comparison, but it doesn't make sense. It seems like a tautology. The political departments are basically the departments tasked with reaching out to particular communities, often minoritized communities. So political departments are where you'll find job titles like Director of African American Outreach or Director of LGBT Outreach, or among the Republicans, Director of Evangelical Outreach, and so on. So that's really where you see disproportionately see people of color in campaigns. Where you see them the least is in the communications departments, and that's both the way that you can make the most money in campaigns. People who work in producing and placing ads get a proportion of the money that's spent on the ads. It's also arguably sort of the most prestigious or most influential part of campaigns, aside possibly from just running the campaign full stop. It's where the speech writing is, it's where the strategy about communication comes from. So the people who are doing the most sort of steering of the message, the cultural production of the campaign are, even among Democrats, are about 80% white. And Diana is somebody I interviewed, and she talked to me about sort of what it was like to be a Latina person working in Democratic campaigns. And she said, it's not just about which kind of work you do. She also said there's this thinking that if you're Latino, they'll only put you in states that have a sizable Latino population, and that means less opportunities. So it's really a workplace that feels, to a lot of people, to the people of color I interviewed, and in interviews that I found on the public record, very disproportionately white. It's also disproportionately well-educated. So, about 63, 65, depending on what year and what data you look at, percent of people in the US have completed a college degree, a university degree. That's the blue at the top, sorry, I said that backward. About 63, 65% haven't completed a degree. Only about a third of people have completed a degree. So the blue is have completed a degree. And you can see that Democratic voters are a bit more college educated than the Republican voters, but neither Democratic staff nor Republican staff have very many people at all who haven't finished a degree. Now, I like education. I'm a college professor. I think people should go to college. So it could be, you could make the argument that having been to university is important for doing this kind of work. But it's certainly not a job requirement. So Susan, who is one of my most sort of straight talking interviewees, said the fact that I happen to major in political science does jack shit for me in this business. The way that the campaign field is organized, in order to get a job, somebody, you do an entry-level job and you move your way up from there. The education that you have comes into it basically none. I see that there's things coming up in the chat. I can't really look at the chat and also talk, and I don't want the chat to come up on the screen, so I'm happy to answer questions when I'm done, which will be in a little bit. Okay, so, they say that the education doesn't matter. Stanley, who owned a consulting firm, said he never asked anybody where they went to school. He always wants to know what campaigns they've been in. And I believe him that that's how he does his hiring. Nonetheless, when you look at at where people went to school, there are really stark patterns. So this is from Raj Chetty's data from this big data set on US taxpayers. among people who went to college at all, whether they graduated or not, only about 4%, these top two lines, the blue and the yellow, went to the most exclusive colleges in the US, the Ivy League or other elite colleges and universities. That's places like where I teach, Swarthmore, Harvard, Yale, Northwestern, a few other places you tend to hear about and that get talked about in the New York Times. So only about 4% of people attended those colleges or universities, but almost 40% of Democratic campaign staff attended those incredibly exclusive, highly rejected colleges and universities, and about 25% of Republican campaign staff. So you can see, again, Republicans are a bit less exclusive by education level or education institution than Democrats, but both you see elite institutions hugely overrepresented. And even these highly selective colleges and universities, that's a lot of the flagship state universities. University of California, Berkeley, for example, is in that category, are very overrepresented in the campaign staff. And part of another way that campaigns are exclusive is in terms of how people get in. So I was saying you have to know somebody, but you also have to do work. You also have to do work that is often really underpaid or even volunteer, and move long distances in order to do it. So Diana was talking to me about that, and she said a lot of folks got their foot in the door being interns in some way, which allows them to prove themselves and get known and get the check mark that they're okay. And then they get recommended for campaign jobs. But she says, who are those people who can afford to live for free or work for free, live without income for a few months? And that's already a certain segment of the population. And that's something I saw really clearly. One of, just for one other example of this, one of the people I talked with got offered a job on a campaign and a primary presidential campaign in New Hampshire, and basically had to pack her car, drive all her stuff up within a few days. She was from Florida. She arrived in New Hampshire without a winter coat. She slept on her boss's floor for the first few days while she was there, and she was told basically, you'll work 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. to start, then it's going to go to 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And she said, really, it's basically 24/7 by the end of the campaign. So while, so the entry level jobs are hard to find out about, you have to know somebody, they're really poorly paid, they often require moving, and there's no guarantee that you'll have a job when the campaign ends. This person, her candidate dropped out before the first primary that year, and then she had to scramble to figure out what she was doing next. So that's the sort of thing that if you come from a family with some, as we said in our other book, The Class Ceiling, where you have access to the bank of mom and dad, then you might be able to take those kinds of risks, but it's really challenging for people who aren't coming from money. And you can also, one of the reasons I show that slide about the exclusive colleges, I don't have a way in my data set to ask people, to identify people's class background. People put on LinkedIn and those sorts of sites where they went to university, they don't tend to put what their parents did for work. But the most exclusive of universities, those top 4%, have the parents of people at those schools have median incomes about 3 times the national median income. So it's disproportionately people from very well-off families. Or to put it much more directly, Susan said, being involved in this type of work is almost like a luxury. Now I'm guessing most of you don't think this way, but a lot of people I talked with, and a number of people, American political scientists I talked with about this also said, why do we care who does this work if they're just doing what it takes to win? Maybe it doesn't matter at all who happens to take these jobs. It doesn't matter if they're like regular people. It doesn't matter if they have connections to people outside of these elite circles, because they're just going to do whatever it takes to win. And that's how a lot of people I interviewed saw it. Rufus, for example, basically said that people in politics can just get a sense of how regular people, how people outside politics are going to react to something. But I would argue, and most of the research on campaigns makes this pretty clear, that it's actually it's not the case that people in campaigns can just run some analyses and figure out what's the best strategy. A recent meta-analysis showed or concluded that the best estimate for the persuasive effects of campaign contact and advertising on Americans' choices in general elections is 0. In other words, on net, on overall, anything a campaign does, it's hard to see that it mattered at all to persuade someone to vote or not, to vote for their candidate or not. There's constant back and forth in political science where people find some small effects and then somebody else questions the study and there's arguments about it. But overall, it's certainly not the case that if you just have the right data, you can know for sure the right decision to make in a campaign. For lots of reasons, partly because even after the fact, political scientists with all the time in the world and a fair amount of resources struggle to identify the causes of election outcomes. Also because you can't actually test everything you might possibly do in a campaign before you do it. So there's this sort of deep uncertainty, both for political scientists and analysts after the fact, and for campaign workers themselves about how much anything they do might matter and how to know what's the right strategy to choose. So how do they handle that? Todd, who's a Republican pollster I talked with, told me he was running a sort of long shot Senate campaign in a special election where the Republican was not favored. And he said, if we win, it will definitely be because we had the superior strategy. But then in that same conversation, just a few minutes later, he said, well, the way the race closes and the definition of momentum and the environment and so many other things are out of our control. In other words, we might lose and it might have nothing to do with anything that we did. And that sort of tension, that contradiction was something I heard from a lot of people, and I think summarizes the way that campaign professionals think about their work, which is both sort of holding both at the same time. If we do the right things, we can cause our candidate to win. And at the end of the day, a lot of things matter that we can't control, and we might not be able to, make the difference in whether our guy wins or not. And so what they end up doing is they're not able to they're not able to assess either rationally what's the right way to go or how good one another are. So here's a little bit more about from people I interviewed about sort of trying to figure that out. Larry said it would be impossible to know for sure who works in campaigns, which other campaign professionals are good at their jobs. People fall for marketing and personal relationships and who they know. At the end of the day, and this is something I heard a lot, you have to use your gut. How do I feel about this person? And Sophia was talking about analyzing a campaign product, an ad that they were considering running rather than another Politico, another campaign professional. But she said something very similar. She said, I thought the ad was stale, out of touch, but my colleague thought it was establishment, a power broker. He had a tin ear for this stuff. We just had totally different reactions. But then she said, there's no way to evaluate who's right and who's wrong. You can't know. But the ad didn't resonate with where the electorate was at. In other words, there's no way to evaluate objectively who's right and who's wrong, but I know I was right. And the way that they often know that they're right, what they talked about over and over again, is through a sort of gut sense and intuition, a practical sense of what is going to be effective. And I would argue that practical sense comes in large part both from their life experiences, their social position, their habitus, and from learning from other people in campaigns. And most of what they're learning is based on sort of intuitions and narratives about what works in the last election or not based on data. It's not an objective, call that they can make most of the time. So to sort of back up for a second, there's two big theories that I found about sort of how campaign professionals do their jobs, given this uncertainty, given how difficult it is to know what's going to be effective. One is the sort of masterminds theory. This is actually something that is implied, at least in a 2012 book by Sasha Eisenberg, the Victory Lab. It's also stated pretty directly in this book, The Election Men, that came out in 1972, 50 years earlier, 40 years earlier. Both of these books basically say, look at all this data these people are able to amass, look at all their high-tech tools. In the Rosenblum era, it was just computers. In the Victory Lab, a lot of the stuff he talks about is experiments and that sort of thing. They're able to target voters and effectively manipulate them or motivate them into voting the right way. So that's one theory. I think what I've shown you sort of made the argument that that's not most of what's going on, although they do have lots of data and they do their best to use it wisely. The other theory is they're just chasing the money. They're just sort of doing whatever will line their pocketbooks the best. And I don't think that's right either. One person I interviewed, Lindsay, I won't read you the whole quote, but he was very emphatic at the end of the interview when I asked him, sort of, is there anything else you want me to know? And he said, if I wanted to make money, I'd be in commercial market research. We do what we do because we believe that the people we help to elect will make a difference for the country. He said, I don't give a damn whether the toothpaste box is green or red. I just don't. But I care a whole lot about who gets on the Supreme Court. I care a whole lot about who gets to be president. I think it makes a whale of a difference for the country who gets to be president. And that's what I heard over and over from people that I interviewed, is they really do care about the party that they're working for. They believe in it. They think it's better for the country. So they're not doing this just to line their pocketbooks, but they also can't do it based on just data analytics and that sort of thing. So what I think is going on is instead that they're very motivated, is basically the quote I showed you at the beginning from Bourdieu. They're motivated in a competition among other people in this field to get to the top of the field. And so a lot of what they're responding to is the desire to be in the quote unquote, in the room where it happens. One of the last people I interviewed for the book actually had left politics, but he said he'd just seen Hamilton with his kids, and he said the room where it happens was a wonderfully universal rendering of the ambition of those of us who don't necessarily run for things. You want to be in the room where that decision's made, when the deal is cut on Capitol Hill. So they're responding to people in the field. They're responding to their own sort of intuition. And a lot of what that actually looks like is this kind of dynamic. It's a fight between the two sides, whether those sides are Republican and Democrat, or whether those sides are different primary candidates. A lot of how people approach their work in campaigns is by reacting to what the other side has done, by anticipating what the other side has done, by sort of being in a fight with other people in politics. A lot of people talked about it as being like a war, being like a sports game. And I think, the key part of that is not just that it feels like that to them, but also that almost nobody talked about the sort of a passion for connecting with voters or communicating with voters or bringing people in or anything like that. For most people I talked to, it was really, their vision of their work was contained in the field that they were participating in. It's contained in the other people who were professionals in the world of campaigns. So I want to make sure I leave time for questions, but I just want to take you through a couple of sort of implications of that. One is that I think it makes a lot of sense with Bourdieu to think about politics as a field of cultural production, as a place where people are sort of making their best guess about what's going to be effective. They're responding to trends, they're responding to each other much more than they're sort of rationally calculating and strategizing about connecting with voters. This quote is obviously from 2010, not from 2020, given the references that Chris is making. Another consequence is that people are sort of doing the same thing over and over. Jerry told me he was moving out of politics when we spoke. He said, there's a cover your ass mentality. campaigns end up seeming really cookie cutter. It's the same people over and over again using the same methods and techniques. He said he thinks this is one of the death knells of politics, why people hate politics. You can't do anything too innovative was his argument, because basically people at the top of campaigns, if you do anything too weird, don't think it'll be effective, regardless of the research, regardless of what, you know, somebody coming in might think. And so you just see sort of the same thing over and over again. I'm going to skip that. One of the things that you then see is that, you know, not only I showed you at the beginning are the contacts coming from campaigns unequal, but we have really unequal participation in our politics. So, you know, non-voters are about twice as likely to be poor as voters. People who vote are, as I showed you at the beginning, very disproportionately white. I think this also matters because of where people who work in politics go after they're done with politics. They go into government jobs. About half of them have worked for an elected official or in government. They go into corporations, they go into consulting. So they're spread all throughout sort of the power system or the field of power in the US, not just in campaigns. And I'll actually stop there. I think I've said most of my implications. And I want to make sure I have time for questions. Thank you.